Marjorie Gilbert was the perfect woman for my father, and I think part of it was because she did have a very loving family. And I always believe that if people have love in their family life, they can give love. You give back. Now, my mother's family, my grandfather Johnston had a clothing factory, strangely enough. They made blouses, and my grandmother was very artistic, and she designed the blouses and made the patterns. And they both went to work, but there was a little bit more, as I say, financial stability. And my mother had a brother and 3 sisters, and it was a lovely family. I think my grandmother also adopted a child, a cousin of my mother's, and she lived with them as well. My cousin, my aunt Hilda, was into acting, as I've mentioned before, and she was working with the BBC very closely. And so as soon as she knew there was a vacancy for one of in the Shakespeare, I think there are some little fairies or something yes, there are some fairies. And Mummy became a fairy and started her broadcasting career. I think she had probably 2 words to say, but she was only about 7. And she had quite a life as a child actor. Before she went to the Guildhall, when she went to the Guildhall about the age of 19. But she did pageants, and she did all sorts of plays and appeared in all sorts of plays. There was, in Belfast at the time, there was very active semi-professional groups that she could act with. And I think she was basically a very happy, loved woman. And that allowed her to give Geoffrey all the love that he needed. And it wasn't that he hadn't had that love, because obviously his parents adored him, but it was so all-embracing without being too much. She just adored him. He had the most marvelous personality. Not only was she very good-looking, but she had a marvelous sense of style. She had good posture because she trained as an actress. She had the most glorious sense of humour, and being Irish, she could tell the most marvellous stories. She was very good at accents. There were no accents practically that she couldn't do, broken Russian or broken German or whatever, apart from, of course, marvellous Belfast Irish. And she was just a joyful, joyful woman. They were very much in love. And she was absolutely devoted to him, and just tremendous fun to be with. She made him laugh because he was really rather proper and rather stressed by all the performances he had to give. And she would relax him and make him laugh uproariously when he came home. And she was just a charming, charming person. Actually, my mother at that time did not work or did not go out of the house to work. She was tremendously occupied, obviously with the 2 children, but with my father, because he really wasn't capable of doing anything other than playing the flute and earning a living. And she did all the secretarial work, she did all the arrangements. When he was doing sessions, she would answer the phone, she'd take down all the details about where he was to be, what time he was to be, what he was going to have to play. And then at the same time, she made sure that his clothes were right, and everything was laid out for him. If he had a concert where he needed evening dress, then it would all be perfectly laid out for him. She was really like a sort of manager, in actual fact, for many, many years. And I don't think he could have done what he did if he hadn't had that sort of woman. They always say there's a great woman behind a great man, and I think in this case it was probably true. As always, there were an awful lot of girls who studied the flute. And in order that my mother would be there if there was an emergency, occasionally somebody would faint or they wouldn't feel well, and my mother felt she wanted to be in the flat when they were present, because it was usually in the afternoons, because he'd have a rehearsal in the morning, concert at night, and it was usually 3 or 4 hours in the afternoon. And she would run in with cups of tea. That was his thing. He had to have cups of tea pretty well with every change of student. And the other thing was, course, that we were up on the first floor, and he couldn't run down the stairs to open the door on the ground floor on the pavement level. So poor Mum had to run down, let the student in, come in, sort of say hello to the student, let them sit in the kitchen until their moment was due for them to go in, and he'd open the music room door, and then there'd be a changeover, and then she'd be running in with the next cup of tea. But he did all the lesson appointments. She didn't have to do any of that. But I'm sure she was kept quite busy just sort of doing the housework and cooking the supper. Remember, in those days we made everything from scratch, and every supper had to be cooked, and it all had to be on time because he would have to leave to do a concert. That's another thing. He was very careful about what he ate before a concert, an important concert or a concerto, and he usually had a lightly boiled egg and cornflakes, because he didn't want to upset his insides or his digestive system. And so it would be on a day when he wasn't playing that we would have, like a Sunday lunch, have a roast and, you know, all the trimmings or lasagna or whatever it was. There is a lovely story about how my parents met. There was a man who was a bass singer at Covent Garden called Norman Walker, and he was a little bit older than Daddy. He was probably 10 years older than my father. He came from Liverpool, so he's sort of mentored my father a little bit, and of course he'd met him at Covent Garden. Norman Walker was teaching at the Guildhall School of Music at that time, and he met Marjorie Forster Johnston, as she was then. She was, what, 18 or 19, something like that. And he looked at her and decided that she was the girl for Geoffrey Gilbert. So he told her that he was going to bring this man called Geoffrey Gilbert to the school to meet her. And apparently it sort of went on, and Geoffrey Gilbert didn't ever come. And then one day Geoffrey Gilbert did arrive, and Norman introduced them, and it was almost like love at first sight. I mean, my father proposed to my mother a week later. Now, he always said it was 2 weeks later, but she said it was a week later. Well, she really didn't want to get married. She hadn't expected to get married quite so soon. She wanted to finish at the Guildhall, obviously, for a start. And she also had a career waiting for her in Belfast. She was not only a broadcaster, but she also was going to teach with her sister, who was Hilda Taggart, who was a representative of the Guildhall, and they were going to get together and get a studio and teach elocution and acting and all that sort of thing. So she didn't really want to get married quite so young, and she fended him off for a time, and he wooed her with flowers. And you know, you can just imagine Geoffrey Gilbert, once he gets an idea into his head, he's going to do everything possible to try and get the girl that he wants. A rather nice story is that in 1935, she wondered how he was getting so many complimentary tickets for all the ballets and operas at Covent Garden. And then she discovered that he was getting them so that he could watch her, make sure she was in the balcony, and he would know that she wouldn't be out with any other young man. So she saw all the ballets and all the operas over that 2-year period. And I think that's when she really fell in love with him, watching him play the flute, because she could see down into the pit and see him playing. And eventually she was worn down. He met her mother, and Granny Johnston loved him, and she said yes, she would marry him. Well, he didn't have any time off, unfortunately, to get married, but Sir Thomas Beecham realised that they were going to be playing a concert in Dublin with the London Philharmonic Orchestra, and the wedding was to take place in Belfast, and Beecham realised if he gave Daddy a day off, or a whole 24-hour period off, my father could go to Belfast, get married, come back to Dublin, and then they could have the concert, and then the following day they went back to London and immediately to Paris. So my mother's life as a bride or as a married woman started off on tour. It wasn't exactly a very restful honeymoon, but I guess she was happy. And they were both, you know, they had a wonderfully happy marriage for 52 years, I think, before he died. In her usual fashion, now it was just as well that she didn't go first, because she had always had a lot of friends, a lot of outside interests, and a lot of friends. And she told me that after that, she never refused an invitation. She went everywhere where people would call her up and ask her for coffee, or they'd ask her for, you know, and she just never refused anything. And I think she was incredibly strong. I mean, we'll never know what went on behind closed doors, but I think she just felt the same way that I did, that if he had to go, that was the way we wanted it to happen. I think the hardest thing really was having all the students call up after his death, because they were all crying their eyes out, and she had to be strong for them. And then, of course, we had an incredible memorial service at Stetson, where the flute players flew in from all over the place, and they formed a flute choir to play at the memorial service. And she went down to see them beforehand, and she said, "I don't want to see anybody in tears. You have all got to remember to gaze fearlessly ahead."